Thanks everybody for joining. As a consultant or engineer, stormwater professional in your career, you play an important role in maintaining and restoring Vermont's waters. By attending this training, you're showing that you're interested in both following the regulations as well as maximizing water quality protection on the landscape. So thank you for taking the time this morning to attend this training. A few housekeeping notes. Look at the top of your Teams window. We will be covering a lot of material in this hour, so we'll leave a Q&A section for the end. Shannon Morrison will be helping me out with that, with the chat, and may be able to give you answers right in the chat too. She'll pipe up if there's a simple clarifying question in the chat, but otherwise we'll wait to the end so we can get through everything. Kevin Burke from Stormwater Program is also here to help with answering wetland questions in relation to the Stormwater Program. He's not here to answer specific stormwater regulation questions, but he's here to help with that, that nexus. During the Q&A section, you may raise your hand. Here's where the chat is at the top of your screen, excuse me. And here's where you can find raising your hand. We will need to unmute you to be able to speak. You can also feel free to use reactions. They'll show up in a few seconds and then disappear. I will be, like I said, I'm recording this presentation. At the least, I'll have the slides up on our website, so you'll see some links throughout the presentation, and those will be clickable once they're up on our website. So here's an image of our program team. We will go through some wetland basics today, talk about how to approach a site with wetlands in mind, and what path you may need to take to follow the regulations, either through permitting, exemptions, allowed uses. So for starters, this is the reason why we're all here, why we protect wetlands in the state of Vermont. There are federal regulations, which I'm not going to speak to today. That is separate from the Vermont Wetlands Program, although we do coordinate with the Army Corps of Engineers. We protect the 10 functions and values that are recognized to be provided in wetlands. Flood control and water quality are two that are in combination with stormwater infrastructure type stuff. So wetlands provide these functions naturally. When left to their devices, they'll continue to do so. Some statistics: 80% of bird species rely on wetlands for breeding habitat. 40% of the world's species live or breed in wetlands, and nearly half of all rare species in the United States rely on wetland habitats. Peatlands store 30% of the world's land-based carbon. The Trust for Public Lands found that in Vermont, an acre of wetland gives a return of $590 in flood protection and habitat in 1 year. They did not evaluate these other protections, these other functions and values, so you can imagine how valuable wetlands are if you give it an economic dollar amount. Unfortunately, historically, Vermont has lost 35% of its wetland area. This is equivalent to the whole of Grand Isle County disappearing, being filled or drained. Over in the Lake Champlain Basin, we believe it to be more along 50% wetland losses. So, understanding the functions and values, the state of Vermont gives wetlands protections based off of the functions that they provide. Those wetlands that are exceptional or irreplaceable receive the highest level of protection and are considered Class 1 wetlands. These are all mapped on the Vermont Significant Wetlands Inventory. So they're easy for you to find, and there are currently 9 Class 1 wetlands. Class 2 wetlands have one or more significant functions and values. They're protected under the Vermont wetland rules. Many of these are mapped, but not all of them are. Class 3 wetlands are neither Class 1 or Class 2 wetlands because they haven't been found to have significant functions or values. So they are not protected by the Vermont wetland rules, no state protections. However, they may be protected by the Army Corps of Engineers. In addition to protecting wetlands themselves, the Department of Environmental Conservation also protects wetland buffer zones. These are regulated zones of upland around a wetland, which can provide protection to the functions and values. There are many ways you can harm a Class 2 wetland by digging and filling from within, but as you can imagine, activities that happen directly adjacent to wetlands, such as discharges, parking lots, noise pollution and such, can harm things like wildlife habitat, water quality protection, and the like. So we protect a buffer zone. Class 1 wetlands receive a 100-foot buffer zone or larger, and those buffer zones are explained in the back of the Vermont Wetland Rules in the appendix. And Class 2 wetlands receive a standard 50-foot buffer zone. So this slide helps explain what wetlands may or may not be jurisdictional based off of this image here to give you some examples. So any wetland on the VSWI map is jurisdictional. So here we have a parcel that was delineated for wetlands in these 3 areas. So we know there's wetlands there. Off the site, we have mapped Vermont significant wetland inventories. So those wetland areas are Class 2 and protected. These wetland areas extend off the parcel onto areas that are mapped by the VSWI. Therefore, they are also Class 2 wetlands. Any wetland that is the same type and size as what is on the VSWI map, a half an acre or larger, is protected. Well, our 3rd wetland on the site is also Class 2. It's presumed Class 2 because it's not officially mapped. And you should assume that those are Class 2 and protected, and look to avoid and minimize, which I'll get into a little bit later. Other wetlands that are protected are wetlands that are adjacent to a stream, lake, pond, or river. Wetlands which are vernal pools of any size are protected, and special and unique wetlands like bogs and fens are also protected under the Vermont wetland rules. So when you're working with the wetlands program, you may receive a document like this, a classification report, a preliminary classification report, where when we're out on the landscape and you need to understand what the classification of the wetland is for permitting purposes, we can provide this information. So you know if you need to get a permit or not. If it is a mapped class 2 wetland, and we find that it may be not meeting functions and values. That does occasionally happen. We would need to do a formal determination to make it class 3. These classifications can be reassessed later in time. So it's really important that when you're working on a project, you have the most up-to-date information about your wetlands. So from what's jurisdictional to what is in fact a wetland, this slide I could make into a 40-hour course and even a career out of determining what is a wetland. That's why we really recommend that you hire a professional wetland consultant to do this work and work with the district wetlands ecologist within this our state program to help determine wetland areas. Wetlands are areas which are saturated in or inundated by surface or groundwater with a frequency sufficient to support the prevalence of water-loving plants. This is the same methodology as the Army Corps of Engineers. So any wetland area that we see is also a wetland area for the Army Corps. The jurisdictional piece is separate. But factually, we recognize the same areas of wetlands. And you need these 3 parameters. You need to obviously have the hydrology, ponding of water, saturation, squishy feet. That allows for the formation of hydric soils, which may be gray depleted soils with orange spots or redoxamorphic features. You could also have a very deep, dark soil or a muck soil. And then, of course, we see hydrophytic vegetation, such as the cinnamon fern on the screen, cattails, jewelweed. Right now, marsh marigold is a good wetland dependent species that's in bloom right now that can help you understand where wetlands are. You need to have all 3 of these parameters to call an area wetland unless you're dealing with a problem site. Problematic sites include vegetation disturbance areas, so like your mowed areas like lawns, soil disturbances such as plowing, and also drought conditions, which very recently we were in drought. And with the recent rains, we may be out of that drought, but that makes it more difficult to find wetland areas. So we need to keep that in mind, and is another reason why we work with professionals to identify these areas. Now, you're dealing with wetlands in developed landscapes. You see here behind the silt fence is a wetland area next to a parking lot, and we have some fencing there to keep the trash and disturbances outside of the wetland area on this site. Here's another one. You have giant reed, which is commonly found in wetlands adjacent to disturbed area. This is an invasive plant. Further back into the wetland, though, it is in a much better condition. Wetlands in developed landscapes can be hard to spot because of the disturbance, such as mowing. Often those areas are the only ones to be underdeveloped or mowed less frequently. So here you see the wetland is in the rough grass, not in the mowed area. So be suspect of those rough and wild patches during the dry time of year, because those may be your wetlands. Okay, now we'll jump to the planning piece. So these slides will be updated on our website soon, so no need for you to rush and write down these links. They'll be clickable in a PDF document. So one thing I really want to stress is not all protected wetlands are mapped. You can't just look at the Vermont Significant Wetlands Inventory layer and see that there are no wetlands and go ahead with your project. Because of that, we have some additional tools to help you figure out where there may be wetlands so your stormwater projects can avoid those areas and their buffer zones. We recently developed a screening tool which synthesizes all wetland mapping layers in an analysis and gives you next steps. It also gives you a map and explains what the different wetland layers are, so you can have a better understand of the probability of wetlands in an area. We have the wetland inventory maps, which are for folks who are more GIS and map layer savvy. You can zoom into an area and see all of the wetland related layers turned on in that map, so you can do a more thorough investigation. On our website, we have a landowner guide, which gives a list of what to look for while searching for wetlands on a site. As a non-wetland professional. So it will walk you through inspecting a hole that you dig into the ground and some common wetland plants to look for and such, just as some initial planning. If you suspect wetlands in the area that you want to build, you really should be contacting a consultant to delineate the wetland area. And we have a list of several consultants up on our website with this link here. We'd like you to contact a wetlands program if you need a wetland classification call, or if you think you may need a permit, because we can help you with pre-application. Now these these three tools as listed are a good start, but to apply for permits, you will need to know your impacts by the square foot. So you'll need a delineation. Okay, so here's an image, a scenario. So in planning, you find that there's a wetland on site. The wetland is at the bottom of the gully. You can actually see the cattails. That's an easy indicator here. It's over 1/2 acre in size, so you know it's class 2 wetland, and you get it delineated. And you see you're trying to deal with this gully erosion issue for a stormwater retrofit. So now you need to see if you can design something that avoids and minimizes impacts. You could start by try working your project elsewhere before looking at the low-lying wetland area. Can this practice be placed further upslope at the source of the problem? Again, the wetlands are providing natural treatment too, and so we want to maximize these projects by keeping the wetland as well as putting in the retrofit. So here's some other questions. Can you use disconnects, infiltration? Can you avoid redirecting the water to or from a wetland, because that can dry out a wetland area or make it a different wetland type? Can you cluster structures and access points, such as using an existing drive to access a forebay for cleaning it out? And there's several other questions that you can look into while designing a project. And we've created an avoidance and minimization checklist that's up on our website that you can go through whenever you're working on a stormwater design that may involve wetlands. These are questions that the district ecologist will be asking you if you're coming in for a permit. So to help streamline that process, looking at this checklist and ensuring that you've avoided and minimized the resource as much as you practically can will really help you through the process. Now, if you do end up in a situation where you are impacting a wetland, we're looking for as much minimization and even restoration of impacts as much as possible. Can you permanently demarcate the edge of the disturbance? Can you plant native vegetation within the buffer zone or the area between the development and the wild wetland area? Can you cease mowing in some of the wetland areas that are remaining? This may also give you some stormwater credit as well to allow these areas to become woolly and wild again. So like I mentioned before, the removal of wetlands on the landscape can counteract our efforts to treat waters before they reach impaired water bodies such as Lake Champlain. It is therefore imperative that structural stormwater infrastructure not be sited within our natural wetlands due to potential loss of water quality. 1 minus 1 doesn't equal 2. Now, the Stormwater Program recognizes the value of natural wetlands and has included guidance and allowances for avoiding wetlands. So working to retain forest cover, natural areas, and undisturbed soils will reduce the generation of stormwater runoff from the site that will ultimately need to be managed. So in the stormwater treatment standards, there's design guidance for allowing to avoid wetland areas. The 3-acre permit has citing criteria that states that projects that are not required to implement treatment or control practices, that if they would require construction in areas of any wetland or its 50-foot buffer. The treatment standards still need to be met, but there isn't a situation where you're required to impact a wetland and get a permit in order to satisfy the stormwater program, DEC stormwater program's requirements. You may be asked to do passive reforestation in wetlands or buffer zones that have been historically mowed in order to help get you closer to meeting the requirements of the 3-acre permit. Doing that passive reforestation or even plantings is not something that needs a permit from the wetlands program. So we are certainly in favor of those types of practices. The municipal roads general permit also has feasibility standards where you are not required to place MRGP practices within wetland or buffer zone. So I have links here for all of those documents to help you through coordinating, of course, your stormwater permits and wetland permits in tandem. So jumping into permitting. So any activity that occurs in a class 1 or class 2 wetland or their buffer zone that is not considered an allowed use or exempt from the wetland rules needs a permit. And I'll be going over exemptions and allowed uses in a little bit. But basically, if you're grading, filling, ditching, dredging, removing vegetation, tree cutting, constructing structures, basically ponds, roads, burying utilities, other infrastructure, those are all activities that are likely to require a permit. So thankfully, in your planning, you've already thought about avoiding, minimizing, restoring areas that might be impacted from your project. So it should be a lot easier for you to go through the wetland permitting process. So here I have a visual display of a non-stormwater project, but you get the idea where someone's proposing a house way in the back of their property. It would require them to drive through the wetland, needing to fill the wetland. There's utilities going in through the buffer zone. Almost the entire house is within the wetland buffer zone. So there'd be a lot of impact associated with this project. But we see over here, this is an area of the property that is neither wetland or buffer zone. And so that upland space needs to be maximized for the use of this project. So you see here, is the project redesigned? There is still some impact within the buffer zone, but we understand that that was a necessary part of the project that could not be avoided. You see that it's the well and the less impactful areas, most of the buildings outside of the buffer zone, the entire driveway is. So that's the approvable version of the same project purpose. When we look at permitting a project, we need to find that there's no undue adverse impact to wetland function or value. So we look at what the functions of the wetland are and how that compares with your project and whether that project impact is necessary. So that means there's no other practicable alternative on the property or on another available property that avoids wetland and buffer impacts. And we look for to offset potential impacts if they're unavoidable through minimization or restoration. There are 3 permit types that we have within the Vermont Wetlands Program currently that you may be eligible for with your wetland project. We have our regular general permit that is 3,000 to 5,000 square feet of wetland or buffer zone impact, depending on the project type. The 39026 is what we call our water quality general permit, which I'll be giving more details in a couple slides from now. And then we have our individual permit where we have to cater the project specifically, or the permit specifically to your project because they go beyond the general permits. So for a couple of examples, this one on the top, you see on this site, there was some hydric soil that was mapped, and the project designer assumed that the wetland area, if any, would be closer to the road and designed a detention pond. After they did so, they had a wetland consultant come out and delineate the site and found that most of the parcel was in fact wetland. Right here, the yellow line, this is the wetland boundary. So the upland area was quite small, and it turned out that the proposed detention pond was entirely within wetland area. And the purpose of this project was to create a 12-hour detention for the 1-year storm with that dry pond. And that would have caused, almost an acre of impact within the wetland, which is likely helping with that flow protection by being a wetland area with hummocks and hollows holding water and such. Fortunately, they were able to change the design to use an existing inlet culvert to create a modified swale BMP. So this is within the same larger development, but on a separate parcel, and they were able to make it work. So we have both the wetland as well as this swale to help with flow restoration. Another example is a flow restoration project proposed to hold back natural wetlands water by creating a berm in a wetland. So it sounds a lot like a beaver dam. Now, placing the berm in the wetland means wetland loss, a change in the hydrology of the wetland. It would be holding back and ponding the water. So there would be significant impacts to the wetland function and value. And there were alternative sites for other flow restoration projects. So the project idea was abandoned in that instance, and other project types were sought afterwards. Okay, so our water quality general permit is called the 39026. It includes wetland permit coverage for all retrofit projects with stormwater permit coverage. So anything with an MS4, MRGP, 3-acre permits, and they need to meet certain criteria, and it needs to be for retrofitting a site. This can be for modifying existing stormwater structures or addition of new stormwater structures on that retrofit site. So it doesn't only mean bumping out an existing stormwater pond. It can be entirely new features as long as it's for the purpose of retrofitting. Um, and since, like I spoke about before, there's still avoidance and minimization that needs to take place with this general permit. So, and with all of our permits, so you should be still looking to avoid and minimize. And since there is um, other ways to do stormwater retrofitting, in most cases, we'll only permit a project for like the 3-acre permit if the project can fall under this water quality general permit and not have larger impacts than this. So the criteria for this general permit is that there's no more than 50 square feet of new impervious surface constructed with the wetland or buffer zone. So that's allowing for an outlet structure. The activity must be exclusively designed for existing impervious surfaces and associated land, not new, expanded, or redeveloped impervious surfaces. So this structure can't have waters directed from a new area of impervious, just existing. We require registrations for this general permit. So you send in a form that is free of cost to our program, and we send you an email back saying, thank you for submitting. You can go ahead and construct your project. So this is fairly simple. You can get that registration if you are impacting less than 500 square feet of natural wetland or buffer, or less than 2,000 square feet of managed buffer, managed wetland, or under 5,000 square feet of managed buffer. So the registration can't total more than 5,000 square feet of impact. if you're impacting up to 7,000 square feet of managed buffer zone, you can get a permit through a notice of intent under this general permit. There are other limitations on the coverage and best management practices which you need to follow, which I can't speak to all of those today, but I did provide a link to this general permit earlier in the presentation that you can look back at. Also important to note, a flow restoration plan may consist of multiple projects and shall not be considered a single project for the purpose of this general permit. So we're not saying the entire city of Burlington needs to fall under these impact thresholds. It's each retrofit site, the practices falling under these impact thresholds would be able to get coverage under this permit. So a few descriptions here on natural versus managed, because we receive questions about that. This is an image of a managed wetland and buffer zone. Managed areas have diminished function, including mowed lawns, road shoulders, parking areas, roads, pastures, hayfields, and croplands. Those are all considered managed wetland or buffer. And the natural areas are what you'd expect. They're minimally managed areas. So natural areas, areas used for silviculture, or old fields that are no longer being managed. So we're allowing up to 500 square feet of natural wetland or buffer impacted under the water quality general permit. However, you still do need to attempt to avoid and minimize. Okay, so now we're moving beyond permitting because there are some examples of where you'd need no permit at all. So here is a Google Earth image of a neat little stormwater pond right here. It has lots of cattails in it. It probably has all three parameters of being considered a wetland, but it is exempt. So wetland-like features, which were human constructed by excavating, grading, or filling, and were created wholly within an upland area, are exempt from the Vermont wetland rules. So the stormwater pond isn't protected as a wetland and can be managed as this original intent. We have an allowed use for existing structures where the maintenance, reconstruction, or routine repair of structures and facilities, or additions to those structures or facilities which do not involve substantial expansion or modification in a wetland or buffer, are an allowed use and don't require a permit. So this image is of a reconstruction project where a house was burnt down and is replaced within 5 years, as long as it's within the same footprint, can be taller or purple. That's fine. As long as it's within the existing structure, it does not need a permit. If you're substantially expanding that house or modifying that house, it would require a wetlands permit. Work associated with routine repair and maintenance may be conducted in a temporary work zone extending up to 10 feet beyond the edge of an existing above ground structure, or 20 feet centered over an underground pipe without a wetland permit. All temporary work zones need to be restored to natural grade and revegetated upon project completion. Now, a non-substantial expansion is shown here at this house. A non-substantial expansion is a one-time expansion of an existing structure resulting in additional impacts to a Class 2 wetland or buffer of 250 square feet or less. And the temporary work zone does not become larger in that instance. Another note is the use of swamp mats for temporary access is not included in the calculation of the 250 square feet, so long as there is no cutting of woody vegetation, minimal soil compaction, and the mats are in place for less than one growing season. So some specifics on roads and the allowed use for maintenance. So tire tracks with no fill, that you want to upgrade into a fill surface, gravel and such, would need a permit. If you work within the existing footprint of the roads, ditches, road shoulder, travel surface, that is an allowed use. The entirety of the road right-of-way is not considered an allowed use to impact. There are a lot of road right-of-ways with no roads at all, and that would need a permit to put in a road or a stormwater structure. Ditches have a special modifier for what is considered non-substantial expansion, because we understand that there's many ditches that need the addition of riprap to fall under the MRGP. So ditches can have a one-time expansion up to 20% of the original width and depth in order to stabilize with riprap. Okay, so here is my last slide. I wanted to give you an option of another potential way to deal with water quality issues in Vermont. So wetland restoration can replace lands acting as a source of phosphorus or carbon to land use that is capable of retention, the wetland. And the secondary benefits for fish and wildlife, flood attenuation, and recreation are really substantial. Doing wetland restoration does not need a wetlands permit. It does need a plan approved by the program, but there's no permit or fee associated with that restoration. The ideal wetland restoration sites are those that historically functioned as wetlands, but were converted to other uses through ditching, draining, or other hydrologic modifications. For the Lake Champlain Basin, you can use the Wetland Restoration Potential Layer created in 2007 and updated in 2017. You see here on this aerial image, there's some pink polygons. They have been identified as having high potential for phosphorus attenuation, and the orange and green are less so. There's a score of 0 to 4 for these polygons for the potential for phosphorus attenuation. This site is in St. Albans Town. Rug Brook runs through the site, and it scores a 3.3. So it would be worth looking into further for restoration. And you can see this mapping by going onto the wetland inventory map, looking under wetland map under watershed protection, and it's called the Wetland Restoration Potential Layer. And you may want to look at this for an alternative when you're working on retrofit projects. Maybe there's potential for a larger wetland restoration project. Funding for that type of work and other resources for wetland restoration can be found on the link below here. So that is what I have for a presentation. Thank you all for staying with me today. Now we can open things up for questions and comments. So please enter something into the chat or raise your hand And while we're waiting for you to chat, I'll just mention that I'll be sending out a email with feedback and certificate requests. So you'll be able to click on a link that will take you to a form to fill out where you can provide feedback on this presentation and you can receive a certificate of completion. These slides and a recording of this presentation will be placed on our training website. Do we have any questions, Shannon?
I am not seeing any in the chat. Actually, George McCain just asked, does the 3% beach expansion for riprap apply to private roads and driveways or just those under MRGP?
Great question, George. It applies for either. Our rules are fairly general. The wetland rules are for any activities occurring in Vermont. So that means that anything that isn't explicitly called out as an allowed use, that's an activity in a wetland or buffer zone, may need a wetlands permit. No other questions? I'll turn off the recording.